Energy has always been more than fuel. It is leverage. It decides which nations rise, which collapse, and which rules are written behind closed doors. In the 21st century, power no longer flows only through armies or currencies. It flows through oil fields, shipping lanes, and mineral-rich ground buried beneath ice and sand. And once again, the world's attention is pulled toward two unlikely places, Venezuela and Greenland. Venezuela, a nation sitting atop oceans of oil, yet trapped in economic paralysis. Greenland, vast, frozen, and silent, but hiding the raw materials that feed satellites, missiles, electric vehicles, and artificial intelligence. Together, they represent two ends of the same struggle, the fight to control the energy of today and the materials of tomorrow. Into this landscape steps Donald Trump, not as a traditional diplomat, but as a strategist who views resources as instruments of power. To critics, his actions signal recklessness. To supporters, realism. But to the global economy, they raise a deeper question. Is this the beginning of a new energy order where access is enforced, not negotiated? As oil markets tighten, rare earths become weaponized, and alliances fracture under economic pressure, the world may be witnessing something far larger than policy shifts. This may be the opening move in an era where energy is no longer traded, but gripped. Venezuela's oil story is not one of scarcity, but of contradiction. Beneath its soil lies enough crude to fuel nations for generations, yet its cities have faced blackouts, inflation, and economic collapse. Oil, once the engine of prosperity, became a trap, binding the country to a single resource while its institutions slowly eroded. Production fell, refineries rusted, and what should have been power turned into paralysis. For global markets, this collapse created a vacuum. Every missing barrel tightened supply, amplified volatility, and shifted bargaining power elsewhere. Energy traders watched closely as Venezuelan output faded from relevance, knowing that its return, sudden or forced, could redraw price curves overnight. Oil is not just burned, it is priced, hedged, and weaponized through expectations. In this fragile balance, external pressure carries enormous weight. Sanctions, diplomacy, and regime change are not abstract concepts here. They directly determine how much oil reaches the market and who controls its flow. When a nation with vast reserves is politically frozen, its resources become a prize rather than a commodity. Venezuela thus becomes more than a failed petrostate. It becomes a reminder that in the modern economy, energy dominance is not about owning oil. It is about deciding when, where, and for whom it moves. If Venezuela represents the energy of the past, Greenland embodies the materials of the future. Locked beneath ice and silence lies a different kind of power. Rare earth elements that do not fuel engines, but enable precision, speed, and intelligence. They are invisible to consumers, yet essential to everything from smartphones and wind turbines to fighter jets and missile guidance systems. Without them, modern economies stall. What makes rare earths uniquely dangerous is not their rarity, but their concentration. Supply chains are narrow, fragile, and deeply political. Control over these materials means control over manufacturing, defense readiness, and technological leadership. In this context, Greenland is no longer a remote Arctic landmass. It is a strategic reserve waiting to be unlocked. Trump's renewed attention toward Greenland was widely mocked as eccentric, even absurd. But beneath the headlines lay a colder logic. In a world racing toward electrification and digital dominance, securing future inputs matters as much as securing oil once did. Geography becomes destiny again. As the ice recedes and competition intensifies, Greenland transforms from an overlooked territory into a silent battleground, where influence is measured not in troops, but in access, contracts, and long-term leverage over the industries of tomorrow. Energy power is no longer exercised only through production. It is enforced through choke points, shipping routes, Processing facilities, financial systems, and regulatory gates now define who truly controls supply. Oil without refineries is inert. Rare earths without processing are useless. The real battlefield has shifted downstream, where raw resources are transformed into strategic assets. This is where dominance becomes asymmetrical. A nation does not need to own every barrel or every mine. It needs to control the system that allows those resources to become usable. Access can be delayed, restricted, or conditioned. Prices can be nudged. Dependencies can be exposed. And when that system is disrupted, entire industries feel the shock almost instantly. Trump's approach leaned into this reality. Less multilateral, more transactional. Less consensus, more leverage. Energy policy was treated not as a climate question, but as a strategic instrument, one that could pressure allies, isolate rivals, and force negotiations without firing a shot. In such a system, energy stops being a shared market and becomes a hierarchy. Those at the top dictate terms, those below adapt or fracture, and the global economy begins to move not on efficiency, but on power. Markets react to signals long before actions are completed. A speech, a sanction, a single announcement can ripple across futures curves and investment flows within minutes. Energy, more than any other commodity, is priced not just on supply and demand, but on fear, expectation, and credibility. When political intent becomes unpredictable, volatility becomes the new baseline. Under Trump, uncertainty itself became a tool. Allies questioned reliability, rivals recalculated risk, corporations delayed capital expenditures, while speculators thrived on sudden swings. In oil markets, the possibility of Venezuelan barrels returning or disappearing moved prices even before reality followed. In critical minerals, the mere discussion of alternative supply sources reshaped long-term contracts. This atmosphere rewards those who can endure instability and punishes those who rely on smooth global coordination. Smaller economies absorb the shocks first. Higher import costs, currency pressure, inflation. Energy importing nations find themselves paying not just for fuel but for geopolitical tension embedded in every unit. What emerges is a new premium, not for efficiency, but for security. And in that pricing model, control over energy narratives can matter as much as control over energy itself. China sits at the center of this equation, not as a producer of everything, but as a processor of almost everything that matters. For decades, it invested quietly in refining capacity, supply chains, and long-term contracts, turning raw materials into strategic dependence. The result is structural power, the ability to slow, redirect, or withhold without ever announcing a blockade. This reality reshaped Washington's calculus. Energy security could no longer be measured only in barrels and reserves. It had to account for bottlenecks, single points of failure, and silent monopolies embedded deep inside global supply chains. Venezuela's oil and Greenland's minerals suddenly mattered not for what they were, but for what they could offset. Trump's confrontational posture toward China cannot be separated from this context. Trade wars, tariffs, and strategic decoupling were not isolated moves. They were attempts to unwind years of accumulated dependency. Energy and materials became leverage in a broader struggle over who sets the rules of the next economic era. As rival power centers harden, the global system begins to resemble a pressure chamber, stable on the surface, but dangerously tense beneath. And history shows that systems under pressure rarely release it peacefully. For decades, globalization promised efficiency above all else. Energy would flow freely. Materials would move to where they were cheapest to process. Politics, we were told, would stay out of markets. That illusion is now breaking. What is replacing it is slower, more expensive, and far more strategic. Governments are redrawing supply chains not for profit, but for resilience. Redundancy replaces optimization. Strategic stockpiles return. Energy independence becomes a national security objective rather than an economic preference. In this world, access matters more than price, and reliability outweighs speed. Venezuela and Greenland sit at opposite ends of this transformation. One represents the risks of overdependence on a single resource. The other, the temptation to secure tomorrow's inputs before rivals do. Both expose a central truth. Energy and materials no longer belong fully to markets. They belong to states. As this shift accelerates, the cost is felt globally. Higher prices, fragmented trade, slower growth. But for those who control the choke points, the trade-off is acceptable, because in an era of strategic scarcity, power is not about abundance, it is about denial. This is where the idea of an energy stranglehold takes shape. Not as a single grip, but as a network of pressures applied quietly, persistently, and with intent. No embargo needs to be declared. No pipeline needs to be shut down on camera. Control is exercised through delays, licensing, financing, and influence over who is allowed to operate and who is not. Trump's legacy in this arena is not defined by a single deal or confrontation, but by a shift in tone. Energy was framed as power, resources as leverage, cooperation as optional. Whether one views this as strategic clarity or destabilizing force depends on perspective, but its impact is undeniable. The rules of engagement changed. For investors, governments, and industries, the message was clear. The era of neutral energy is over. Every barrel, every mineral, every shipment now carries political weight. And once energy becomes a weapon, restraint becomes a liability. The world is no longer asking who has the most resources, but who can afford to let others use them. So the question remains, is this a moment or a direction? Was Trump merely accelerating a trend already underway, or did he fundamentally redefine how power is exercised in the global economy? The answer may lie not in Venezuela's oil fields or Greenland's frozen ground, but in how nations now behave because of them. Energy is no longer assumed to be accessible. Trust is no longer built into supply chains. Governments plan for disruption as a baseline scenario, not a crisis. And once that mindset takes hold, it rarely reverses. The grip, once tightened, does not easily loosen. Venezuela's oil may one day flow freely again. Greenland's rare earths may eventually be mined at scale. But even if they do, the lesson remains. Resources are no longer just economic inputs. They are instruments of influence. In this new era, the world's energy system is not collapsing. It is hardening. And the question is no longer whether someone is gripping the stranglehold, but whether anyone is strong enough to escape it.